a little bit about the high-tech development in the Garden State, video game origins in the Northeast, the family history of New Jersey game development firms, platforms, developers, and game sidetracks into I'm going to give you sidetracks into technical and personal trivia, and I'm going to be talking a lot about my own personal experiences in game development in New Jersey. And I don't mind being asked a question while I'm talking, as long as it's about what I'm talking about. And if I say anything that you think is incorrect, because this is really an expert audience, and if you think you're wrong about that, Scott, I don't mind being corrected. I'd like to be right. Okay. Legacy of invention in New Jersey in Menlo Park. The phonograph, motion pictures, and light bulb were invented. American Marconi started here in Adeline with the radio. The Victor Talking Machine Company came from Camden, New Jersey. RCA Laboratories is from Camden, New Jersey, and then Princeton, New Jersey. I worked at RCA Laboratories in the 80s for 9 years. The LCD, the laser diode, black and white and color TV were perfected here, and DirecTV was invented here. Bell Labs also came from New Jersey. They invented the transistor. Not a very important invention. They invented relay logic and lots of other stuff. Critical inventions involving video games in New Jersey include the video game, or in the Northeast include the video game console was invented at Sanders Associates Labs in New Hampshire by Ralph Baer in 1966. The 6502 CPU used in Atari and Nintendo consoles was developed at MOS Technologies in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in 1975. The Atari 2600 was reverse engineered at James Wickstead Design Associates in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey. Now, as far as games goes, in 1979 to today, James Wickstead Design Associates and Cedar Knolls worked on some of the early 8-bit games from 1979 on. Starting in 86, Imagineering worked on 8-bit games in Glen Rock, New Jersey. From 86 to 85, Absolute Entertainment, the publisher, worked in Glen Rock, New Jersey. From 95 to 2000, Morningstar Multimedia was publishing out of and developing out of Ridgewood, New Jersey. And from 86 to today, I made this presentation a few years ago. Some of these companies might not be here anymore. But in Edison and Hazlet, New Jersey, there was Majesco Entertainment. The timeline. It all started with HP's development of the VIDEC word processing machine in the 1970s. VIDEC was sold to ExxonMobil, the gasoline and oil company. When VIDEC word processing was closed down, a lot of the employers from there went to create James Wickstead Design Associates in the 1980s. Some of the people at Wickstead left and went to Activision East. I'll give you more detail about that. They went to Imagineering Incorporated. They incorporated their own company. It's with the same name as Walt Disney Imagineering, but being in New Jersey, working in New Jersey, they didn't have to fight for the rights of the name Imagineering. Imagineering also spawned a sister company, Absolute Entertainment, in order to do publishing of games. When Absolute closed down, Morningstar Multimedia opened up, and later Majesco opened up in Edison, New Jersey. I worked for Imagineering as a contractor, and the other intervening companies out in Majesco. James Wickstead Design Associates. Here's the original group on that company. From left to right is Andrew Bergman. I didn't meet him. Roger Booth behind there smiling. I worked with him. He was a brilliant programmer. James Wickstead is in the back there, the head of the company. Robin Balweg in the front was their graphic designer. Henry Will, the fourth, is there, and Todd Marshall is on the right there. And he has the same last name as me because he's my little brother, and he was an audio specialist for their company. Gary Kitchen and Steve Kitchen were also with the company. There was 3 Kitchen brothers that were very important in game development in New Jersey. Wickstead started with 4-bit games, the Wildfire and Bank Shot, pinball and pool table simulators. They were just simply, the display was an array of LEDs. Robin Bellweg was one of the first, at least around here, video game graphic designers, graphic animation designers. And she started with this sign on Times Square. This is the big animated sign right in the middle of Times Square that's now a video screen. But at that time, it was an array of red, green, and blue incandescent lamps. And she worked on a computer and designed these animations there. And in the late 80s, she moved there to work for James Wickstead Design Associates. Here's one of her games. It was a Pink Panther knockoff derived. I'll put on the sound since. Do we have the sound? Okay. Aha. Let me get. Okay, I have to unmute it here. Here we go. That's it. This was a cutting-edge game in, roughly 1980. And she was the animator that did all the animations for that platform. Also, in the reverse engineering of 2600, one of the important games was Space Jockey by Gary Kitchen. And they did 14 more games. The publisher for those, James Wickstead, developed the games. U.S. Games published the games developed by Wickstead. You might recognize this. This looks like Atari Williams Defender. Do you remember that game? Looks just like it. Okay. Gary Kitchen and family and his friends moved from James Wickstead to work on a branch of Activision called Activision East, from left to right. Kevin Colcutt, I don't really remember him. Dan Kitchen is the next one there. He was the youngest of the Kitchen brothers. In the middle there is Gary Kitchen. He was the boss of the operation. I don't remember Paul Wilson, but I worked a lot with John Van Ryzen. He was a very skilled developer. All right. In '83, the home video console business crashed, mostly as a result of ET Rush developing their ET cartridge. 3.5 million carts were unsold. They dumped them in a landfill in Arizona. Isn't this a great picture I found? There's E.T. right down there that they dug up years and years later. They tried to do it in secret, but people found out. Video games were declared dead. Yes?
Wasn't that Alamogordo, New Mexico? Wasn't that Alamogordo, New Mexico?
Probably, I think that's correct, yeah. Alamogordo, New Mexico. Did I pronounce it right?
I don't know if I pronounced it right. So.
Okay. But then after a few years, the Nintendo NES came out in the summer of '86 with a much more advanced system with much more fun games. And right around the same time, the Sega SMS, Sega Master System, came out, 1986. So everything changed. I was still working at RCA then. I was really interested in working in games, and when I got laid off by RCA after GE bought them. It was a volunteer layoff. I said, please take me. I want to be laid off and work on video games now. I started contract for Imagineering and Absolute Entertainment. They were in Glen Rock, New Jersey. The building that they occupied was the upper floor here over, it used to be a pizza shop there. When I was there, I developed, let's see, yeah, Atari 7800 Crossbow, Sega RC Grand Prix. I worked on Game Boy Scrabble. I worked on, for the NES, Bart versus the Space Mutants. I didn't work on A Boy and His Blob. That was done by David Crane, who worked on it in that building too. And I worked on Ghoul School when the company was there. Okay. A lot of work was done with independent contractors. I was an independent contractor for the companies that did games here in New Jersey. I worked out of my home. I visited the offices occasionally. And some of the people who worked on games in New Jersey remotely were John Van Ryzen in northern New Jersey, Roger Amadon worked from Hopewell, New Jersey, Nick Eastridge from Princeton, New Jersey. I worked from East Windsor, New Jersey, and David Lubar worked from Yardley, Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. Games I did for the Atari 7800, I adapted Crossbow from the arcade game, Touchdown Football, adapted from the Commodore 64. I did a Sega Master System original game, RCA Grand Prix, which was their answer to Nintendo RC Pro-Am. I worked for the Game Boy, I worked on Spell Checker and Scrabble. For the NES, I worked on Flight of the Intruder, Simpsons, Bart versus the Space Mutants, and my own Ghoul School. And then I worked a few years later on the Sega Genesis for a translation of the Frogger arcade game. For a Nintendo Game Boy Color, I worked on Monopoly. I converted a black and white game to color. Worked on something called Tonka Raceway, which was really an adaptation of the RC Grand Prix that I did for this Sega. Nicktoons Racing, and finally, the last game I did around 2000 was something called M&M's Bash for the Nintendo Game Boy Advanced. Here I am working on the original system in 7800. This is 1986. Let's see if I can point out what everything is. Yeah, that's me. This is an Atari ST that I did the programming on. It had, I recall this is a SCSI connection to a special board that plugged into where the cartridge was, or was it the CPU? I'm sorry, I don't remember now. But you could run a debugger on this. It's the CPU? I see you nodding.
I'm familiar with these generally.
Yeah, thanks. My brain's getting kind of old now. I don't remember every single detail, sorry. But that's how I developed games for the Atari 7800. Now I'm going to talk about the MOS Tech 6502 CPU. It was used in the Atari 2600, same CPU in the Atari 7800. The only improvement between those two was the graphics. And then on the right, the 6502 was in the Nintendo NES. However, they had their own special chip made for the Nintendo. And I want you to notice, whoops, laser. I want you to notice here, this is the actual chip of the 6502 CPU. And if you look carefully here where I made a yellow circle, you can see the same image there. And this is the Nintendo CPU chip. And it's got a lot of additional stuff here. When I asked my audience, what do you think all that stuff does? They usually say graphics. The answer is sound. All of that extra stuff added to the CPU is the sound generation hardware, believe it or not. And I think that was one of the best things about the NES was that they put more effort into sound than other hardware manufacturers, especially Atari. And I think that made a big difference for players to have the music constantly playing and have the sound to be richer than the really crummy sound that you got on the Atari units. Okay, the Zilog Z80 was important mostly for two games. The Sega Master System used Z80 in its standard form. Then later, the Game Boy used something they called a lean Z80. It's sort of it's the same as the Z80, except it's broken. Some of the more advanced instructions are busted up and don't work. It also has something called a FF page instead of this 65020 page. They added FF page, if I recall correctly, onto the Lean Z80 for the Game Boy. All right, and that's me working on the Game Boy Color. It's a lot of systems like this. There's the there we go. The development system is right here. A program on the PC, and it wires through this ribbon cable to where the cartridge plugs in. And there's a slight modification to the Game Boy that allows interrupts and breakpoints and things like that. All right, my first game was an adaptation of the Atari 7800 Crossbow. It's the maybe you remember the arcade game. It's a light gun that looks like a crossbow. You aim and you blast at things. And the way we did that was the first step after we decided to do the game was we got a few rolls of quarters, and we went to a pizza shop, I think it was. We brought a video camera, a camcorder, and we pointed at it, and we just played and played and played until we experienced every single screen in the game, recorded them, made copies of the tapes, sent the tapes to the graphic artists, and a tape to me where I timed everything. I figured out everything that happened in the game, made it as accurately as I could as a representative of the game. It had two versions or two options. You had a joystick where you could point the crossbow and fire things, a standard joystick. It also had a version where there was a light gun that Atari provided. Next. I also did a version for the IBM PC, and I had to do three different options for the different video cards on the PC, CGA, EGA, and for Hercules. That was kind of complicated. This is the actual play of the PC version. And I put up these two. This is a box cover for the game. And you'll see there's pretty much the same version there, but there's a sticker here. And I'll tell you what actually happens. This was actually a fine art painting done by somebody that was this big. They took a photograph of it and put it on the box, and everybody thought it was beautiful. But when they offered it to Toys R Us, they said, there's too much information here. So the answer was, they already printed up all the boxes, so the answer was to put this sticker on top of all the boxes that went to Toys R Us. I wish I knew where that painting was. It's probably owned by Gary Kitchen, I guess, or maybe the original artist. I don't even know who the artist is, but it was a beautiful piece of work. Then I did Touchdown Football. This was a Commodore 64 game, and all I had was uncommented code of the entire game. And I had to, within a few months, figure out what the code did, translate all the output graphics to Atari 7800 graphics. And I also had to do the sound myself. Let's see if I can turn on the sound. You can hear typical Atari sound effects.
Play using an overcomplicated system using the 8 directions on the joystick plus the...
Nope. That's somebody talking over the game. This is on YouTube. Never mind. All right. Also, one of the games done at Imagineering in Absolute Entertainment was a wrestling game. I asked them if, do you want to get the license from the World Wrestling Federation? And they said, oh, no, we asked them. They want $10,000 up front. That's too much. So they just called it wrestling. This is the same game that they did for the 2600 and the 7800, and they just improved the graphics for the 7800 version. Okay. Nintendo put out RC Pro-Am, and one of the people who worked, it was a tester who worked for Imagineering and Absolute, was an RC racing fan, and he thought we should do an RC racing game that was more accurate, more like actual RC racing. So we developed our RC Grand Prix. That's on the left it's not a clone of RC Pro-Am, it's inspired by RC Pro-Am. And that one, let's see, I could go on and on about it, but it was a pretty fun game to build. There's a what's that called? The Sega Game Gear version of that. It looked exactly like that. It could run Sega Master System games, except it had different buttons on it. I had to go in, they had lost the source code. I had to go in machine language, change the start button to the A button in order to make it work on the Game Gear. And that was a hit in Brazil, in Europe, and also in Australia. It actually was amazing how many units they sold of that one. Then the Game Boy came out, and they wanted to do educational games or applications. So I made a spell checker for them, and I had to create a dictionary compression stuff for that, and they used that to make my compression code on their Scrabble game. Then while I was working on Ghoul School, which was my original NES game, I wanted it to be a Game Boy game, but they said, do it for NES. The development system was late in coming in, and so they said, okay, why don't you do scrolling for Flight of the Intruder? I said, okay, so I developed a scrolling algorithm for that. Let me see, did you see the scrolling of the carrier deck underneath the plane? That was my code. They gave me 1 week to do that. And then at the same time that I was making Ghoul School, which was my own original game on the right side there, Absolute was making Bart versus the Space Mutants. And they used my scrolling code for that. So in parallel with Ghoul School, they worked on Bart versus Space Mutants. So you can see that there's a lot of similarity in walking and jumping and scrolling and things like that. All right. At Absolute Entertainment, I'll tell you about the development culture. They often created their own development systems in order to save money. They wrote their own 6502 and DMG, Lean Z80 assemblers. You know what DMG is? That's Dot Matrix Game. That was Nintendo's code name for the Game Boy. Graphics, music, and audio converters and compressors were made by the people there at Absolute. They made custom system hardware. Their in-circuit emulator for NES and DMG were custom built. I developed something called Make World, in order so you could design worlds by dragging and dropping bricks and other objects onto the background screens for scrolling worlds. They worked long hours to make deadlines. There was always a panic to have the game done for Christmas release. And the normal date to have the game ready and done for Christmas was July. But things were always happened late, and they could sometimes push it to almost to, I don't remember, the early fall. They could finally squeeze it out if they had reserved an assembly line for the NES in Japan or something like that. But there was always a panic. Let's say, typical deadline work hours. If you were on deadline, you typically worked from noon till 3 a.m. every day. People got sleep deprivation, fainted, and were spitting up blood. And the people working on the games, there was little distinction between the hardware developers, software developers, and the artists. Everybody did everything. All right. There was, for my Ghoul School game, it was, the idea of Ghoul School was, in the game story, a high school had been invaded by ghosts and ghouls and monsters, and one kid had to come and save the whole school, and you controlled that kid, and you had to blast all those ghoulish enemies. While I was working on that, I had the weapon called the Spinal Tap, and that was because there were parts of bodies invading the school. One of them was the spine. You find the Spinal Tap weapon, you go and you zap it. And one of the censors in Nintendo didn't like that because I thought that was a drug reference. So I turned that into a spinal zap, where you have electric spark, kind of, that kills the spine. And the remainder of that change is in the original NES manual. They have a picture of the Spinal Tap, but everything else says Spinal Zap and everything, because they already had made the pictures for that and nobody caught that. Nintendo games, the NES games, were not allowed to show blood. That didn't apply to my game, it applied to other games. But they could get away with showing blood if it wasn't red. In my game, the strength meter actually meant how much gangrene you have. Because it's sort of a ghoulish, deadly game, and I thought that would be funny, My gangrene is at 90, I'm almost dead. And they said, oh, that's too gross. So I just made it a strength meter. Also, I had an idea. Why don't we make the main character that players control a black person? And they said, oh, no. White people wouldn't want to play that. Okay, whatever. Also, I wanted to become a licensed property. I thought Ghoul School would be something that could become a TV show and things like that. Nobody else was interested in that. All right. Now, on the left and the right, now, do you remember Pitball by David Crane? That's on the left. David Crane also came to New Jersey to work on A Boy and His Blob for the NES. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's a lot of similarity between these games. David Crane did the graphics for the Running Man. On both of these, you can see they look about the same, but other artists did the background graphics and the graphics for the characters. All right. Let's see. I quit Absolute Entertainment, quit doing games because it was threatening my mortgage. So, because it was just so hard to make money with the people I was working with. So I worked for educational testing service for a while, but then after that I worked on a PlayStation word game, a war game for Absolute Entertainment. I still had they had cash flow problems. they got overextended and liquidated. They were just making too many games at one time and not enough hits. You were making money for them. Dan Kitchen, the younger brother of the Kitchens, started his own company called Morningstar Multimedia, and he called me up and says, "Scott, you want to make more games?" So the first thing I did for them was a Game Boy game. There was an existing Monopoly game for the Game Boy, and they said, "Why don't we make it in color?" So the original Game Boy Monopoly is there on the left, and my colorized version is on the right. And you wouldn't believe how I had to do that. I didn't even have the source code for the Game Boy game. I had only the binary, and I had to put it into a disassembler, and I programmed it. I changed it from black and white to color in machine language, believe it or not. Adding screens. It was a fascinating project. Then they asked me to do a Frogger adaptation of the arcade game to the Sega Genesis, and that was a blast, actually. I had on the left is the simulation of the arcade game that ran on the PC. That was my reference. On the right is the Sega Genesis version that I had done. And that was a fun project. For Frogger, that turned out to be the last game made for the Sega Genesis. Believe it or not, the Sega Genesis has a complete 8-bit Sega Master System built inside of it. And I thought, well, it's an 8-bit game from the arcade. Maybe I could just translate the code. I had the binary for the original arcade game that I put in a disassembler and printed it out and studied it. It didn't really tell me much. It was too hard to figure it out. But I found the graphics and the music from the arcade game, and I put that entire binary into the Sega Genesis adaptation and referenced that for the graphics and for the music. So I developed my own version of the player. You'll probably remember it. I'll turn on the sound for that. It got a lot of credit for being very accurate to the arcade game. I could have done better if we had more time and money. I could have done more advanced graphics, but I thought, if I could match the arcade game exactly for the home, that the players would like it. Okay, next slide. Then I did something called Tonka Raceway for Morningstar. It was published by Hasbro. It's basically my old RC Grand Prix game for the Sega Master System that I just rebuilt to run on the Game Boy Color. It had a rumble pack on it. You know what that is? You've heard of the rumble pack? It's a haptic. It's a little motor in there with an off-center weight that you can just turn. The program can just turn on and off, and it rumbles. It jiggles in your hand. All right. Then I did Nicktoons Racing, which is the same game. This the RCA RCA Grand Prix, but it's with different graphics basically and different racetrack layouts. And we did something called a high color mode for the Color Nintendo. Have anybody hear of the high color mode for the Game Boy Color? It's just, the NES and the Game Boy Color can only display about 16 colors at the same time on the screen. So as it's scanning the lines, every line you reload the color table. It's a pretty advanced system, and you can make some really beautiful images. I can do photorealistic stuff on it, but they just needed cartoons. And you can say it's practically the same game, but with different, and with the music. Let's see. Then my last game was around 2000, something called Eminem's Blast. It was on the Game Boy Advanced. And that was a real pretty game, a complicated game, because it could allow 4 players to play at once, where the Game Boy Advances were wired in daisy chain. It was a fascinating project. I'm going to turn on the sound for this because we're talking about sound today. The sound for this was programmed and written by a company in Germany. And the amazing thing is that almost all the CPU time to run this game on the Game Boy Advance was consumed by the music, because it was just waveforms and memory that they scaled for pitches and added together. It took up something like 75% of the CPU time, and it was a very fast CPU. 16 bits, 32-bit address space, and that was my last game. Okay, that's the end of my presentation, and I can show here the end of the game that I did, the Ghoul School game. It's kind of fun. Yeah, and the final boss is this ghoul in the boiler room. This is the head cheerleader. Your mission is to save the cheerleader who's been kidnapped by the boss. You take her out of hiding there. Then you wait. See, the points are adding up here. That took a little too much time. I should have made that faster. And then I'm going to show you the final screen. Can you see the details here? Very well. I guess only a few of you can see it. So the Ghoul School turns into the Cool School, because you've killed all the ghouls. You've killed the master ghoul in the school. And you can see here that the girl, the cheerleader steps away from him. It's sort of a joke on the save the princess trope. And that's the end. Okay. That's where I got the title. Thank you. Any questions?
Which was your favorite?
What's my favorite? The game? Favorite? Yeah, my own original game, Ghoul School.
Okay.
Was definitely my favorite, yeah.
When
Anything
you
else?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about how you had to drop into assembly or do machine language, or I guess machine language, not assembly, like right down to the binary. But like, what did you usually program in? Like, if it was a high-level game, it was planned. Like, was it C? Like, what were you developing?
It was almost always assembly language. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last game for the Game Boy Advance, you could program in C, but occasionally drop down in binary. Yes?
So which was your favorite system to develop for, and which one had the better documentation from the manufacturer?
The Game Boy Advance was the best. Yes?
Here you go.
You mentioned that compensation was an issue. Did you just get paid per hour, per the job? Did you ever get any kind of commission? Was there any kind of, based on sales, did you get any extra bonuses or anything ever?
Yeah, I was paid by the contract, which came through by milestones. Each time I accomplished a different part of the game, I'd get a payment. And some of the contracts included a royalty deal. It was so the payments for the contract were considered advances. Then I'd get royalty if sales were beyond a certain point, and they never were. Okay, anything else?
Hey, at first I was a little surprised to hear you describe the process of being assigned an arcade translation, but then seemingly not being given much support. You described crossbow, having to go out on your own with your own rolls of quarters to record. Were there any translations that you worked on? I think this is a pretty comprehensive overview. But even talking with other developers, were there any times where you would be given design documents or any sort of materials from the original developer to make your process easier?
None whatsoever. Okay?
Anyone else? Oh, got one more over here.
Oh.
What was the biggest team that you ever worked part of, and how do you guys divvy up the work? Like, was it hard? Was it challenging?
Yeah, the biggest team was for the M&M's Blast for the Game Boy Advance, because the programs are fairly large in that. There was a lot of graphics in that. So they had several people working on graphics for M&M's Blast, and they had a lot of testers working on it that I worked with, who helped design the worlds and plot things on the screen. They also had a subcontractor in Russia to do the mini games for that, and the subcontractor in Germany to do the sound and music. And there's somebody I worked with to help with the link. It was one of the hardest things with either the Game Boy or the Game Boy Advance, was the system that linked several Game Boys together was messy and ugly. It required a lot of programming and error checking. So I needed help from a systems engineer to get that working properly.
Were there any copyright issues? Like Frogger, copier?
Well, you know, that didn't involve me, the copyright issues, because I just got the assignment.
Right.
And the people who gave me the assignment had presumably worked out the copyright issues. But I can tell you there was one glitch in that. When Morningstar had me do the Frogger translation, they believed they had the copyright secured, but they didn't. And so they got in trouble for that. That's kind of a long story about how that happened. Okay. Anything else?
Oh, one more.
So for the Game Boy Advance, with the sound you were talking about, were you, because it consumes so much CPU time, did the Game Boy Advance just have to like bit bang a DAC?
Can you go louder, please?
Oh, for that last game you were talking about with the Game Boy Advance sound, because it consumes so much CPU time, was the Game Boy just like directly bit banging a DAC to get audio output, or was there any kind of like hardware acceleration?
I believe there was no hardware acceleration. They just sort of made samples and then loaded them into, a timed output to D to A.
Oh, okay.
The music, yeah.
No other questions? Let's give it up for Scott Marshall.
Thank you.